For a long time, people spoke about space as though it were a quiet attic above the Earth, full of telescopes, noble speeches, and the occasional flag. That attic now houses missile warning, intelligence collection, navigation, military communications, and a fair share of national paranoia. In this video, we're going to walk through why orbit is turning into contested ground, why major powers are treating it like warfighting terrain, and why a fight in space would not stay in space for very long. NATO now explicitly treats space as an operational domain tied to deterrence and defense, which tells you the mood has changed from stargazing to planning. The first mistake people make is assuming space became military the moment uniforms started talking about it loudly. In truth, the military importance of space has been building for decades because satellites quietly became part of the machinery that keeps modern states alive. They handle communications, precision navigation, reconnaissance, missile warning, and timing signals that feed everything from armed forces to banking networks. Once that happened, orbit stopped being scenery. It became infrastructure. And infrastructure, like a good bridge or a bad airport, attracts strategic attention whether it wants to or not. NATO's current public posture is quite plain about this. Space supports communications, navigation, and intelligence for alliance operations, which is why NATO formally recognizes it alongside land, sea, air, and cyberspace. That shift matters because it changes the whole meaning of military power. A state no longer has to strike only tanks, ships, and airfields. It can go after the nervous system behind them. A satellite constellation that feeds targeting data or secure communications may sit hundreds of miles overhead, but in military terms, it is as real as a runway. According to NATO's 2025 update, the alliance's overarching space policy exists to ensure the right space-based support for operations and missions. That is bureaucratic language, but the meaning is simple enough. If you rely on orbit to function, orbit becomes part of the battlefield. The heavens, as usual, have been drafted into service without being consulted. Once a society depends on something, rivals begin studying how to break it. That is the second step in the story, and it is where space militarization stops sounding abstract. Modern militaries rely on space systems for command and control, targeting, surveillance, missile warning, and global positioning. Disable enough of those systems, and you do not merely inconvenience an adversary. You blind him, slow him, confuse him, and make every other weapon in his arsenal less useful. This is why space is now treated less like a scientific frontier and more like a strategic layer of combat support that could be contested at the opening of a crisis. The loftier language has thinned out. Strategy has a way of removing perfume from the room. The U.S. intelligence community put that reality in blunt terms in its 2026 Annual Threat Assessment, released in March 2026. It states that China's counterspace operations would be integral to military campaigns, and that Beijing has capabilities intended to target U.S. and allied satellites. Russia, too, remains a threat across multiple domains, including strategic systems that could complicate U.S. defense and escalation management. According to that assessment, the danger is not theoretical or far off in some cinematic future. It is part of current threat planning. That matters because the first move in a major conflict may involve degrading the orbital systems that make modern force projection possible. Space is relevant because it now sits in the chain between command and consequence. The next sign that space has become a battleground is doctrinal. Militaries do not create formal warfighting concepts for amusement. They do it when they believe an environment is mature enough to require categories, missions, and personnel. The United States Space Force has crossed that threshold. In April 2025, STARCOM published Space Force Doctrine Document 1, which lays out how the service thinks about military activity. That alone is revealing. When an organization starts defining its verbs, it is telling you it expects to use them. What is striking in the doctrine is how direct the language has become. According to that document, space control includes 3 mission areas. Orbital warfare, electromagnetic warfare, and cyberspace warfare. Orbital warfare is described as combat operations conducted through fires, movement, and maneuver to control the space domain. That sentence should end any lingering belief that governments still view space as a politely neutral zone floating above earthly rivalries. They do not. They view it as terrain that must be secured, defended, and, if necessary, fought through. Once the phrase orbital warfare appears in formal doctrine, the conversation has moved a good distance beyond science museum posters and school assemblies. Space is no longer a backdrop. It has become a place where power is organized. Of course, people hear space warfare and picture giant explosions and debris. Real counterspace activity is usually less theatrical and more unnerving. A satellite can be jammed, spoofed, dazzled, hacked, shadowed, or physically threatened without producing the kind of spectacular image that would make the GK. That is part of what makes this domain so dangerous. Ambiguity gives aggressors room to operate below the threshold of open war. It is one thing to respond to a missile strike. It is another to respond to a mysterious service disruption, while lawyers and generals argue over whether it counts as an attack. CSIS's Space Threat Assessment 2025 describes this picture in detail, covering trends in foreign counterspace weapons and highlighting issues like GPS jamming and spoofing, satellite rendezvous and proximity operations, directed energy threats, cyber methods, and the broader spread of reversible and destructive capabilities. According to that assessment, the danger is not confined to one dramatic class of weapon. It is a whole menu of ways GD that menu keeps expanding. And because many of these methods can be masked as technical faults, they create a strategic environment full of plausible shrugs. Space warfare, in other words, may begin with somebody insisting nothing happened at all. China sits at the center of this story. Beijing does not treat space as a decorative branch of national prestige. It treats it as part of a larger architecture of power. The sheer pace of Chinese space activity has become one of the clearest signals that orbit matters in military planning. Numbers usually tell you where attention is drifting. The U.S. Space Force's Space Threat Fact Sheet states that by November 2025, China had more than 1,301 satellites in orbit, a 667% growth since 2015. According to the U.S. intelligence community, counter-space operations would be integral to PLA military campaigns. This is not a story about patriotic photo ops. It is a story about building a resilient orbital ecosystem that can support state power in competition and conflict. The rockets rise, the satellite count grows, and somewhere a planner smiles in a windowless room. Russia shows the other side of the problem. Russia demonstrates how a state can remain dangerous in space even while under strain elsewhere. Moscow views asymmetry as a practical answer to U.S. advantages. You do not need to outbuild an adversary in every category if you can make his dependence into a liability. When you cannot match, you disrupt. The Secure World Foundation's 2025 Global Counterspace Capabilities Report offers a clear look at this environment. It assesses 12 countries across multiple categories. Russia appears as one of the states that has conducted debris-causing anti-satellite tests, emphasizing the military utility of these tools for the near future. The age of orbital innocence did not end with a bang. It ended under committee supervision and threat reporting. Another reason space is a battleground is commercial entanglement. The line between civilian and military space is wearing thin. Commercial launch firms and satellite operators are increasingly entangled with national security missions. That changes the character of the domain. It means commercial systems may be folded into deterrence planning and, in a conflict, treated as relevant targets. NATO made this trend explicit in February 2025, when defense ministers agreed the alliance's first commercial space strategy to improve cooperation and resilience. This matters because it confirms that private firms are no longer orbiting around defense as a side business. They are part of the architecture. Orbit now includes contractors and procurement paperwork. That is usually the point where an issue stops being niche and starts wearing a tie. All of this can still sound remote until you bring the consequences back down to Earth. A serious disruption in space could hit communications and navigation, financial timing, transportation, and emergency response. The battlefield is relevant for the same reason plumbing is relevant. You only think about it when it fails. A January 2026 Defense News analysis argued that 2026 would be a pivotal year for U.S. readiness as the Space Force transitions toward full-spectrum warfighting. This is not a case of distant planners gaming out exotic scenarios for the year 2045. It is a present-tense change in how major powers understand power. Once orbit became the scaffolding of modern life, it was only a matter of time before states tried to seize it. That is, the tax one pays for dependence. For centuries, men looked upward and saw wonder, majesty, and the promise of distance from earthly conflict. They still can. States, regrettably, are less poetic. They look upward and see communications links, missile warning, and vulnerabilities that decide the opening hours of a war. Orbit has moved from background condition to contested strategic layer. The frontier has acquired warfighting doctrine. That usually means history has arrived. In the next video, we're going to look at what a real war in space would actually involve, what gets targeted first, and why the opening shots might look like interference. Watch that one next. This has been Gene Botkin with Ellen Arda. End transmission.